Well, good morning. Glad we can worship God together again this morning. If you joined us, we're glad you did. And if you stuck around, of course, we're glad you did. The sermon this morning is a little bit different than what was printed in the bulletin. I called an audible after I texted Terry, so she did not make a mistake. I want to make that clear. But we're going to be looking at David and Goliath today, which is a well-known story, account in the Bible, maybe the most well-known. I remember back in, I think it was 2010, I remember the Super Bowl was the New York Giants against the New England Patriots. And some of y'all might remember that year, I think it was, that the Patriots went undefeated in the regular season and through the playoffs into the Super Bowl. And the New York Giants barely squeaked out of the regular season and through the playoffs and got into the Super Bowl. And I remember the pundits and the talking heads on ESPN and SportsCenter and all those places describing that Super Bowl as a David versus Goliath matchup. And we hear that kind of language all the time in sports and in other places where if you've got somebody maybe who's smaller and it's less likely for them to win, going against somebody who's larger and it's more likely for them to win, even people who maybe have never read the Bible, have never gone to church, they know that that's a David and Goliath matchup. They're familiar with this idea of unlikely success and this idea of somebody small fighting somebody big. But here in 1 Samuel chapter 17, I hope you'll turn there in your Bibles if you haven't already. We're just going to go through this account that's given to us in God's Word and draw some application for us as Christians, because there are a number of really important lessons we can learn from this episode of David and Goliath for our own spiritual lives, and that's relevant for us today. So 1 Samuel 17, we're going to start just with some context and some commentary, looking at some of these, this passage and looking at some of these details. The first thing we're going to notice is that the scene is set for this battle. Look at 1 Samuel 17, verses 1 through 3. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Soko and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. So this was the common setup for ancient battles in Israel's time and place. You would get two armies, one would be on one mountain, one would be on the other mountain. There'd be a valley between them, and they would run downhill into each other into the valley, and the valley is where the battle would take place. So this is nothing out of the ordinary. You've got two armies that are opposing each other that are going to battle. Now, those of us who are familiar, we know that God has ordered Israel multiple occasions to rid this land of the Philistines, and it still hasn't happened yet. But we've got this battle shaking out before us between the Philistines and Israel. But notice we're introduced to the Philistines' champion. We know him, of course, as Goliath. But notice the way the text describes him there in 1 Samuel 17, 4 through 11. 1 Samuel 17, beginning in verse number 4, and a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. I don't know when the last time you measured things in cubits and spans was, but that's about 9 feet, 9 inches tall. So this Goliath is very tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. So the weight of his armor is 126 pounds. Can you imagine that? Just your vest is 126 pounds. So this is a big, strong man. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels. That's about 15 pounds. Just the spearhead on the end of the spear was 15 pounds. And a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And you, the servants of Saul, choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So we've got Goliath. He's the champion, and really what he's suggesting is very simple. Instead of us wasting all this time and resources, you just pick a guy to fight against me, and winner takes all. Now that's a very good proposition if you're Goliath, right? This is like going to the basketball court and Michael Jordan or LeBron James is challenging you to one-on-one, and the winner gets to take the other's house, right? That's not really a fair setup. You know you're going to lose. You know you're going to lose everything. There's no reason for you to agree to that. So Goliath, from head to toe, is built for intimidation. He's tall, he's big, he's got armor, he's got a helmet, and his coat of mail, actually in Hebrew, the word there is scales. So he almost looked like a huge snake. And he's standing before these men, and he's yelling at them, challenging them to send someone to fight him. And of course, really what he's doing is he's trying to get into their head. And it works. Look at verse number 11. Look at what it says about Saul and the men. Verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, for the men of Israel to be afraid and greatly dismayed, it's really not that big of a deal. But what's the problem with Saul being afraid? Think about that. He's the king of Israel. He's the Lord's anointed. And I don't know if you've ever been in this situation, but if you know that the person who's in charge and the person who's the leader is scared, everybody else is going to be scared too. It's pretty much guaranteed. So this man, Goliath, is able to instill fear into Saul and into the Philistines. And we have this great contrast here. So we're introduced to the Philistines' champion, but now we're introduced to Israel's champion. And the contrast cannot be any starker. We get to read this description of David, who, of course, King David, as we know him, though the kingdom had not been given to him yet. But notice, beginning in verse number 12 of 1 Samuel 17, now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons, and the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of the 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. So the contrast cannot be any, we turn, it's like the camera pans from Goliath onto David. And what you've got is this young man who is the youngest son of an old man, right? He's really not much of anything at all. And while his older brothers are away at this battle, he is running back and forth, running errands, taking care of his father's sheep. Right? So the contrast is meant to be there on purpose. You've got a professional warrior, head to toe in armor, versus like a young shepherd boy who potentially wasn't even old enough to fight in the war. Numbers chapter 1, verse number 3 tells us that in Israel, a man below the age of 20 could not fight in a military battle. So it could be the case that David was below the age of 20, and that's why he wasn't in the battle. It could have been because of his dad's age, he had to stay home and had that family obligation to take care of the sheep. Either way, there's a huge contrast between David and Goliath. And then we see David is sent on this lowly errand. Look at verses 17 through 19 of 1 Samuel 17 with me. It says, Then Jesse said to his son David, Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So while all the men are there ready for battle, David is really just a gopher for his dad, and he's running some cheese and some bread and some grain up to the real men who are going to fight against the enemies of God's people. That's kind of the scene that's being set for us here in 1 Samuel 17. But when David shows up on the scene, he hears the talk of the camp. Look at 1 Samuel 17, verses 20 through 25. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he went to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. It was about to go down. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. So Goliath has this speech that he's rehearsed, that he keeps saying, and now David hears it. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. Think about that. They've got God on their side. This is the army of God's chosen people. And they're so scared of this one man that they're running in the opposite direction. Verse 25, so the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. Notice that Saul really has sweetened the pot for anyone who is willing to kill Goliath. He says, you get to marry my daughter. Now that might sound weird to us in 2024, offering your daughter as a prize for killing somebody. But back then, marriage was mostly a political thing. And to marry the king's daughter would mean a lot for you, right? Because your son with the king's daughter, he might be the next in line for the throne. Now you get to have the political positioning of having the king as your father-in-law. That would be advantageous. Obviously, a break from taxes is always nice. Obviously, some riches is always nice, right? So Saul is really saying, hey, I'm unwilling to go and fight Goliath, but maybe if I bribe one of my men, I could work up in them enough courage to go and do what needs to be done. But David needs to confirm that this is true. So he starts asking some follow-up questions. You know how rumors can go. Things sometimes seem too good to be true. And David really wants to know, am I really going to get a break from taxes and get to marry the king's daughter if I go and kill this Philistine? But notice verses 26 through 30. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So David had already heard, but he's asking for confirmation. And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. Anybody here have a younger sibling? You ever get mad at them? Yeah, every time they open their mouth, right? So Eliab is watching his little brother run around asking these people all these questions. And you could just see the anger starting to rise in his face. And notice what he says to him. Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. He said, you just want to see something exciting happen. You need to go back to those couple of sheep our dad left you with. In verse 29, David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? And really, what he's saying there is, isn't there something here worth fighting for? Isn't there something going on here? Isn't there a reason for me to be here and to ask these questions? And for Eliab, it really is embarrassing. Eliab is angrier at David than he is at Goliath. He's more willing to withstand his younger brother than he's willing to withstand the enemy of God. In verse 30, David turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and these people answered him as the first ones did. So now David confirms that it is true that whoever kills Goliath will get great riches, will get to marry the king's daughter, and his household, his father's household, will be exempt from taxes. We begin to see David's faith and courage in that verse that was read for us from 1 Samuel 17, verses 31 through 37. I want us to zoom in to David's words here and David's willingness to do what needs to be done, what nobody else is willing to do. 1 Samuel 17, beginning in verse 31, now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Hey, there's this young man who's asking again and again what the reward is for killing Goliath. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Now think about, you've got a young man, potentially younger than 20, who's really at this point a nobody. Though he's been anointed, he's really officially a nobody. And he's telling the king of Israel not to be afraid because he'll take care of it. And right there, you see the difference between true good leadership and poor leadership. David has to make Saul feel better and tell him not to be afraid. And Saul, of course, is the actual king. So we see a big difference between David and Saul. And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." In other words, this man's been killing people since before you were born. You can't go and fight him. It's not going to work out for you. Notice David's response, and here we see his conviction, we see his faith, we see his fearlessness. And his point, his rebuttal to Saul is, not only am I experienced, but the Lord will give me the victory. Look at what he says there, beginning of verse 34. David says to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing that he has defied the armies of the living God." Notice that Goliath never mentioned God. He said, "I defy the armies of Israel." But David knew what that meant. He knew that Israel is God's chosen people. He knew that to lay your hand on God's anointed is to lay your hand on God. And he knew that this was religious. It wasn't just civil. He knew that Goliath was defying God himself. Moreover, notice verse 37. David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will, not he might, not he should, not maybe, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." You know what's so interesting in this for me? Not only David's faith, but Saul. This is the first time we read Saul talking about the Lord in this whole chapter. And it wasn't to get his troops to be brave. It wasn't in prayer for God's help against Goliath. It was giving David the task of going and fight. Yeah, go, and the Lord will be with you. We see Saul's faith already is a little bit shaky. But courage and faith can be contagious. David's willingness to fight Goliath rubbed off on Saul. And notice that David and Goliath prepare for battle. Look at 1 Samuel 17, verses 38 and following. "So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail." Now this is really interesting. Saul is trying to get David to look more like Goliath. Hey, Goliath has these things. He's got a coat of mail. He's got this armor. Why don't you wear it too? And what Saul doesn't realize is that God's arsenal and God's armor is not the same arsenal and armor that Goliath is using. That David doesn't need the things of Goliath to beat Goliath. David has something different. So Saul tries to give him this armor. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." So David took them off. Now, a lot of people say here that the armor didn't fit. The Bible doesn't say that. It could be the case that it didn't fit. But what it says is, "I have not tested them." Now, for David, his main weapon is a sling. I don't know if you've ever seen, you should look it up on YouTube. Look at these guys using these slings. It's not like a little slingshot wrist rocket that we used to play with. This is a full body exercise to get this sling up over your head and to spin it around and to release a shot. So David's probably thinking, hey, I need more mobility than this armor affords me to be able to go out against Goliath and to use what I know. So David took them off. And this really is, I think, some foreshadowing, right? Because Saul takes the royal clothes off to put them on David, and David refuses to wear them, right? So David's not going to be a king the way that Saul is a king. He's not going to follow in Saul's footsteps. But notice what we do read about David. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, and a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. 2 things. 1, think about the providence of God. How long did it take for those stones in that brook to become smooth? Probably a long time. But God knew from the first time they were in that body of water that David was going to use them to slay Goliath. They were there for a reason. That's how God operates. And notice the contrast here between David and Goliath. Goliath's head to toe in armor. What is David wearing? He's got a staff, he's got a bag with some stones in it, and he's got a sling. That's it. So the Philistine came, verse 41, and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." You have to imagine Goliath seeing David would have been a shock for him. Right? The whole time he's been taunting them, "Come send me your best warrior, let's fight toe to toe." And they send this boy, this young man, in a shepherd's outfit with a sling and a pouch with some rocks in it. Doesn't seem like a fair fight. And Goliath says, "All right, I'm going to make quick work of this." But then notice that David gives the battle to the Lord, and he prevails. Look, beginning in verse number 45. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." So for David, it wasn't David versus Goliath, it was Goliath versus God. And guess what? 10 times out of 10, Goliath versus God, do you know who's going to win? God. That's why David was confident. Hey, I've got a sling and that's it, and that's all I need. Because it's God versus Goliath, not David versus Goliath. This day, notice verse 46, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you, and this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know, not that David is great, not that David is strong, but that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Notice David puts all the glory, all the power, all the praise for the victory in the Lord. And he doesn't say, "Oh, it might be a close contest. We'll see whose God is better." No. God will give me this victory, and he will make it so that people know that God is real. Look, beginning in verse number 48. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. He wasn't scared. He was running toward him. Then David put his hand in his bag. He took out a stone and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face on the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley of the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaaraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, and put his armor in his tent. Notice that David cuts off the Philistine's head with his own sword. We'll have more to say about that later. But the Bible, especially the book of Proverbs, the book of Psalms, is full of this admonition that the wicked will fall by their own devices. How ironic is it? Don't you see the justice that the same sword Goliath was going to use to murder the enemies of God, the armies of God, that's the same sword that David uses to slay Goliath. And notice all the difference that a courageous leader makes. Now, the same people who were cowering in fear, notice what they're doing. There, the text tells us there in verse 52, they arose and they shouted and they start chasing the Philistines. What was the difference? The difference was one man who had faith and courage and gave the victory to the Lord. And here we see David, true leadership. We see the power of faith, not just for one's own self, but for those in our sphere of influence. That is the account, essentially, of David and Goliath. With the little bit of time we have left, let's look at some principles of application for us as Christians. What does this battle have to do with us? What can we learn from it? In the first place, the first principle for application is that conviction is courageous while crowds are cowering. I think a lot of us, if you're anything like me, you want to have courage. You want to be the person like David who can stand up when everybody else is sitting down. You want to be the person who's not afraid of the enemies of God and what they say and how they boast and how they threaten. What makes somebody courageous? It's this one simple thing that David had and nobody else had, and it's conviction. David really believed that God is real and that God is able, and that made all the difference in the world. Everybody else, that was a question mark for them. Saul was scared. The whole army of Israel was scared. David knew that there was a God and that he is real and that he is powerful and that he was going to get that victory that day. David had a conviction about who God was, about God's ability, about God's faithfulness, and that allowed him to sail over the sea of doubt and fear and to do what needed to be done, to courageously face an enemy, knowing that God would give him the victory. David had what every other single man that day seemed to lack. He had conviction, and that conviction made him courageous. God help us to have this same conviction, and when we have that same conviction, we will have courage. Full of doubts, that doesn't lead to courage. Full of maybes, what ifs, I don't knows, that doesn't lead to courage. But when we are convicted, then we can be bold. Then we can stand up for what's right, even if we do it alone. It's been interesting to me. It's always jumped out to me. Revelation chapter 21, verse number 8. And there we read a list of sins, a list of sinners who will be in the lake of fire. And that verse is famous for a song that talks about liars going to the lake of fire. Maybe you've heard it. But that list of sin, it includes liars, but the first one, the first word in that list of sin, it speaks to those who lack courage. And we're not talking about anxiety, we're not talking about mental health, we're talking about you know what's right and you refuse to stand up for it. That is a sin. Every single time, that is a sin. And David was the one man that day who had the conviction that led to the courage of doing the right thing. God help us to let that be true for us. If we want courage, if we want to stand up for what's right, then we have to be convicted of these things that we know and we believe. So conviction is courageous, even while crowds are cowering. In the next place, God's past deliverances are proof of his future faithfulness. Think about verse 37 and what David tells Saul. Saul says, you can't go out against Goliath. He's been a man of war since before you were born. And David says, the same God that delivered me from the lion and the bear will deliver me from this uncircumcised Philistine. So when we're stretching our comfort zone, when we are approaching uncharted territory, maybe we're tempted and we're not sure whether or not God can get us through, we need to remember God's resume. We need to remember what God has done in the past. Now, I don't know for you, but I can look back in my life and I can see the faithfulness of God through his providence getting me to where I am today. And when I look back and I see the faithfulness of God, that gives me courage to face an uncertain future because I know the same God that got me through the past is the same God that's with me in the present, is the same God that's going to be with me into the future. And I can look back at what God has done, and that gives me confidence for what God will do. That's what David did. He said, I'm confident in God, not because of my own ability, but because I know what God has seen me through already, and I know he'll see me through this. God help us to have that same outlook, that same attitude. And we have an advantage that David didn't. We have the complete Word of God. We have God's full and total resume. We see all of his works, all of his deliverances, all of his faithful promises, and all the times he fulfilled his word. We have all of that for us right here in these 66 books. We know what God can do. We know what God has done, and that ought to give us confidence for what God will do in the future. The same God who did all of that, the same God who was with you through everything, that you thought you couldn't survive, that same God is still with you. My buddy Hiram likes to say, you survived 100% of the things you thought you wouldn't. Why is that? It's because God was with you. He strengthened you. He saw you through. Paul had to learn this same lesson in 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 10. He and his co-workers were in a situation in Asia. He said it was so bad we despaired life itself. But God allowed us to endure that so that we would rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. And he says in 2 Corinthians 1, 10 and 11, that God has delivered us, God will deliver us, God is delivering us, and God will deliver us. Let God's track record give you boldness to face the future, even when the future is uncertain. The next point of application, faith really is the victory. What separates David from the rest of the Israelites in this account? He's not stronger. He's not bigger. He's not better equipped. He doesn't have better armor. He doesn't have better weapons. What separates David from the rest of the men in this account? Faith. He believed that God was with him and that God would give him the victory. If we're going to be different from the world around us, and there's a lot of people right now who are really scared because of our political situation, because of our economic situation, because of things going on in the world. There's a lot of people in the world who are terrified. And if they look around and the Christians are scared too, what is that going to make them do? Or if they look around and the Christians are as scared as they are, but we've got the hope of heaven, but we know who's on the throne, but we know the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and we're as terrified as they are, what is that going to do? Right? Faith is the victory. Not only does it separate us from the world, it makes us different from the world, at least it should, but it also helps us to overcome the world. David could overcome Goliath because of his faith, and we can overcome the difficulties of this life because of our faith. 1 John chapter 5, verses 4 through 5 tells us who is the one who overcomes the world. It's the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. It tells us our faith is the victory that overcomes the world. If you want to be different from the world, if you want to overcome the difficulties here, the only way is to have faith, to trust that God is able to do what he said because of his track record, because of his resume, because of who he is. Trust him, and that trust will propel you into overcoming the world. Not only faith really the victory, but your giants are not giant to God. Your giants are not giant to God. Why is that important? I'm going to read from you from a commentator writing about 1 Samuel 17. He says, so compelling and well known is the drama of David versus Goliath that it has become the primary historical metaphor in Western culture for describing any individual or group who overcomes seemingly insurmountable odds to beat an oppressor. All he says is everybody knows David and Goliath. They use it all the time to describe when the odds are against you, and yet you overcome somebody. This is how he finishes that thought. Listen to this. But the biblical narrative is not primarily a story about human courage and effort. Instead, it is about the awesome power of a life built around bold faith in the Lord. Right? David did not defeat Goliath because he's so good with a sling. He didn't defeat Goliath because he was more skillful. He beat Goliath because he gave the victory in the battle to God. So David and Goliath is not about overcoming insurmountable odds through our own courage and ability. It's not about, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. It's about what God can do when you give the battle to him. And David made it clear in no uncertain terms, I'm going to beat you not because I'm better than you, I'm going to beat you because God is going to give the victory. All of us certainly have spiritual giants in our lives that we have to fight against. Maybe it's sins we keep going back to. Maybe it's temptations, diverse temptations that we face every single day. Maybe it's difficulties we want to give up. Maybe it's other things in our life. Maybe there's financial situations, mental situations, physical situations. David teaches us something. Whatever it is in your life that seems insurmountable, that strikes fear into your heart, give it wholly to God and trust him to see you through it and watch him do it. David shows us the way, and he shows us that your giants are not giant to God. My giants are not giant to God. Personal story. I know it's going to seem petty to some people, but because of some past experiences in my life, I've struggled with very serious claustrophobia. And at one point, it got so bad, I could not get into an elevator. And I had to go to therapy just to be able to get on the elevator again. I know it seems silly, but I did. And I was blessed to be able to go to some faith-based counseling, some faith-based therapy. My therapist asked me a question that seems kind of like a stupid question, but it really opened my eyes and helped me to see my fear to get over it. And this wasn't the first thing he said, but we were in these sessions and he's trying to get me to overcome, this fear of tight spaces and help me to get onto an elevator. And he asked me this question. He said, Forrest, do you believe in God? I was like, yeah, of course. He said, do you believe God is with you everywhere you go? I said, yeah, in a manner of speaking, yeah, of course. And then he said, do you believe that God is afraid of elevators? Now, the obvious answer to that question is no. And he said, if God is not afraid of elevators, why are you afraid of elevators? And that might sound like a silly question to you, but for me, it really struck a light bulb that turned on for me. And I said, wait a second, I've got nothing to worry about. Right, so whatever the fear is in your life, it's probably something bigger than elevators, probably something bigger than tight spaces. But if you're looking down the barrel of something that seems insurmountable for you, remind yourself that God is not afraid of that thing. And God is with you, and as a Christian, God is going to help you through it. So our giants are not giant to God. Quickly here, last couple, God's arsenal is always otherworldly. Look at when you think of verse number 47 and what David says, he says, all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. It's not the rock and the sling that slew Goliath. It was God Almighty that slew Goliath. And we should be reminded that in our battles, we are in a really real war. We are in a war, a spiritual war, that is waged every single second of every single day. But the Bible reminds us, Paul the Apostle reminds us in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5, that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but we have supernatural powers through God, through Jesus Christ, not that we can perform miracles, but he gives us an arsenal that's able to overcome those forces of dark spirituality. That we can, by keeping every thought captive to Christ, that we can overcome in this spiritual war. But it's not going to be by fighting a physical fight. It's not going to be by destroying God's enemies physically. It'll be by trusting him and making sure that we obey Christ and helping others to see the light as well. But God's arsenal is always otherworldly. Lastly, we ought to rally behind the champion who slew our enemies. Anytime you see David be heroic in the Bible, you should try to see how this reminds you of Jesus Christ. See, Jesus is the son of David. He's a descendant of David. He sits on David's throne. And when we see David here slay the enemies of God's people, we should be reminded that Jesus has done the same thing for us. While we were fearful and overwhelmed and cowering, Jesus is our champion who slew our greatest enemies. Through death, he overcame death. And in so doing, he overcame Satan. And by giving his blood and his body, he overcame sin. These three giants are ones that we cannot defeat, cannot face on our own. And Jesus is the one who cut off Satan's head with his own sword. Through death, he destroyed the one who has power over death. Hebrews chapter 2, verse number 14. He is the ultimate serpent crusher. He's the champion of God's people. He tasted death to defeat death. He was sinless, and he died to defeat sin. He came to destroy the works of the devil, the Bible tells us. So we ought to give the battle to him. We ought to recognize that it's Jesus who won for us victories we never could have won by ourselves. It's him who overcomes the devil. It's him who overcomes sin. It's him who overcomes the world. It's him who overcomes death. And if we are in him, that victory is ours as well. So for us, what should we do? We should let the victory belong to God. We should tap into his otherworldly arsenal. We should have the faith that brings the conviction we need to live for God in the modern world. We can rally behind our champion, Jesus Christ, who just like David slew our worst enemy for us. So we don't have to cower in our camp. We don't have to, as Christians, wonder whether or not God is for us. We don't have to worry about what will happen if we fight our enemies on our own strength, because the Lord Jesus Christ has and will fight for you. That's his promise to Christians. So what do? We lift his banner. We rally behind his charge. We let his victory be our own by placing our resolute faith and trust in him. And we have the awesome opportunity today and every day through Jesus Christ to overcome the world, to give this fight with our giants, to give that battle to God, to trust that he's more powerful than we are and he loves us enough to fight on our behalf. We know he already has through Jesus dying on the cross. I hope you'll come to your champion, Jesus Christ, if you haven't already, who slew your giants for you, death, Satan, sin, so that you could be forgiven, so you could have the hope of everlasting life, and so that you can overcome the evil one through faith in him. David and Goliath teaches us a lot, but it ought to show us and remind us of what Jesus has done on our behalf. At the right time, when we were still weak, Christ died for the ungodly. We were like those Israelites cowering in that camp, but Jesus Christ did what we could never do. He paid the price that we could never pay. He satisfied the debt that we owed. Won't you come to him? Give your life to him if you haven't already. Maybe you're going through something you need God's help with. Let your brethren pray for you as we stand and sing.
There's a